Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Today's guest expert is Joan Kuhl. Joan is the founder of Why Millennials Matter. She is an author, speaker, and champion of women in leadership. Through her international speaking engagements, research, and consulting, she has guided leaders from more than 60 countries and transformed the internal workings of some of the world's largest organizations, including Goldman Sachs, Eli Lilly, the University of North Carolina, Kenan-Flagler Business School, and the New York Mets. She is the author of 3 books, including her newest book, Dig Your Heels In, Navigate Corporate BS, and Build the Company You Deserve. Joan, so great to catch up with you today. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, Jake. It's good to talk to you.
You know, it's amazing as I read through your bio, I have so many thoughts going through my head that there is so much going on. Tell me, how did you get to where you are today?
I think that's a great question. So I'll sum it up like this. First and foremost, writing a book about advancing women in the workplace is inspired by not only my own career, but I have a long history of volunteering and serving on boards of organizations that invest in girls' leadership, Girl Scouts, Girls Inc., Girls on the Run, Step Up for Women. And in my corporate career, I spent about 13 years in the pharmaceutical industry. I was still always really passionate about inspiring young leaders. I was always a speaker on college campuses and a mentor to early career professionals and the interns. And around 2008, 2009, around the global recession, I started to see companies pulling back on the investments that would develop young people, their potential, really those early, younger employees. And that inspired a lot of the research I did around generational dynamics in my MBA program. So when I decided to just take this leap and play a bigger role, I wanted to continue to work with big companies, but I wanted to really move the needle for young professionals across different industries. I started to realize that the value proposition for young professionals was what they wanted, flexibility, meaning and purpose, and strong, trusting, meaningful relationships at work. That was everything that women wanted, deserved, and were lacking. And so there was a research project I worked on about 5 years ago that really just struck a chord in me that I need to help women that are working today really thrive for everything that they deserve and their talent and the perspective they bring into every business to also open up the door for the next generation. And that's what brought me to this book.
Well, very cool. And I want to jump into that research a little bit and tell us some of the main things that came out of it, but start with, why you felt at the time, and we're looking back 4 or 5 years ago, why at the time you felt that a survey was needed, a study was needed, a real deep look about, women in the workforce and why it mattered at the time, and then tell us what it led to.
Well, I think many women around that time period, 5, 6 years ago, that was when the Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In came out and started to become really a national then global conversation. And the data is what prompted me to do something, which is although we were making progress in terms of entering certain fields, and we have more women than men graduating with degrees in 93 countries, we're still not breaking the barrier when it comes to the senior most levels of leadership. There's still a third of women in senior leadership positions at most companies. And it just didn't make sense because what I was reading and learning was that women are good for business. So if you even just go from having 0 women on your board to 3 women on your board, there's an increase in 15% in profit and 60% return on equity. And the other thing is, you have things like Fortune magazine always posts their most admired company list. Well, the companies on that list have twice as many women in senior leadership positions than those that are less reputable. So women are working in organizations where they're inspiring inclusive culture, and that benefits everyone, women and men. And finally, we also see that gender diverse companies have 3 times more employee engagement and 22% less turnover. So when women stick around, everybody sticks around. And so that just inspired me to say, okay, but what's really happening? What's happening for her that's holding her back individually? And let's not always just put it on her. What's broken in the system? And that's where I think the aha moment was me is, how can I partner with organizations, the men that really want to be allies and do the right thing to figure out how to change the processes and the systems to benefit everyone.
And this is really interesting. About the time that you started this study, I was living in San Jose, California, right? San Jose, the heart of the tech industry. We have all the big tech companies. And at that time, there was a number of studies coming out looking at some of these big companies, Google and Facebook, and showing the ratio and the percentages of women in leadership was very low. And it was a topic of conversation. If you went one-on-one with any of the leaders of those companies and you said, okay, do you believe that a woman could do this job? The answer would almost indefinitely be yes. Do you think that they have the talent, the education, the skill? Yes. So when you went one-on-one with people, the answers, whether it was truthful or not, the answers coming back were absolutely. But then the research and the data showed that it wasn't happening. So why wasn't it happening when you look at one-on-one conversations saying it should be kind of moving in that direction? I mean, most people I talk to agree with you, even though the data doesn't show that that's what's happening.
Okay, so I think there's two things going on there. That's a great example. So one is the fact that I often hear men say, we're doing great. Like, look how many, we have a lot of women that are leading in our company. And the truth would be that there'd be 2 out of 15 women that are leading. And so those are opportunities to say, while we're making progress, we're not at equal representation. So sometimes people feel like, oh, we've got one woman and she carries, the torch for everyone. So I think that there's still some type of block of really just understanding the numbers, the data, the representation, and facing that and being really intentional about recruitment and succession planning and promotions. The other side of this is just the everyday bias. And that's where I found that men have been really engaged. So I was telling you that I led this amazing workshop at Major League Baseball this week, and it was half the room were men. There's over 150 people there, and men of all ages. Some are in management leadership jobs and some early career professionals. And what I found, and they told me, you can see it in the feedback forms, that was most striking for them is they didn't know the data. They just really didn't understand that, wow, this is clearly an issue, and also the business case for it. But then the other side is some of these everyday things happen very unconsciously. Let me give you a quick example. Have you ever seen in an office setting where somebody asks a woman to pick up the food for an office party, or do they mind kind of coordinating around so-and-so's birthday? That's called office housework, and it typically falls on women.
Can I ask a question about that? Because you're absolutely right. I see this in almost every company that I've worked for. I see this. Now, is this a bias in the fact that we lean towards women to do this? Or, and I think in more of the cases that I've seen, this isn't necessarily a gender role, but a position role. And it tends that more women tend to fill the roles of, let's say, assistant or front office or receptionist, which are the positions that we would mostly lean towards to pick up the food or set up the room or do that kind of thing. And maybe it's just this internal bias. Like I said, you're talking to a male here, a man here in the workforce, and maybe this is a block that I'm seeing. But when I looked at it, it wasn't so much that I was saying, you, because of your gender, need to do this, but more, this is the role of the receptionist to kind of get this set up for us. Whereas we had many other women within our workplace that were not picking up the meals, were not, setting up the room because their position was CFO of the company or their position was salesperson or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think that that's an interesting point. I mean, the research shows that women are expected to do more office housework than men. And sometimes, to your point, there could be some positional bias, but it typically is gender bias. And so tasks like taking notes, planning events, onboarding new hires tend to be seen as women's work due to the stereotypes that women are more communal and giving than men. And even women in the workshops, like one woman said, honestly, I always just continue to do it because I just feel like I can do it better than them. Well, we got to be aware of that too and share the responsibility and decline those requests. Unfortunately, there's always a double bind sometimes for women where if they do decline requests for help, they're often penalized for it, while men can, say no and have less pushback. So here's the solution though, right? So we can talk about these things, but like, what do you do? That's what men are always saying to me, but I don't know what to say in that situation. All you have to do is say, hey, that's not really merited this job. Let's try switching things up. Let's choose someone else this time, or let's rotate. Just little things like that. Because the reason why we're saying this is her doing that type of office housework takes her away from core responsibilities, and it suggests that her time isn't as valuable, which can be demeaning. And even if it's a positional bias type thing, she's going to get penalized for not getting some other priority done when she's doing something could be a shared task.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up some very interesting points because as I work, in my current role, we have different assignments that we do. And I say assignments, but really they're offered up as volunteer opportunities. And kind of what you were leaning towards and what I've seen a little bit is that some of the women that I work with are more inclined to jump in and to volunteer and to take on these responsibilities. And because they do that, of course, it starts to create the habit. And one of the ones you mentioned was taking notes. And I was just thinking back to a meeting that I was in last week. And somebody on the meeting, we all work remote. So the meeting was over Zoom and there was about 6 of us there. Somebody had to take notes. And so who wants to take notes? And the first person to raise their hand just happened in this case to be a woman. Now, she does a great job. She does take great notes. She probably does feel that she could do it better than me or better than anybody else. But what it starts to create is this habit, this culture where, okay, next week, well, you did such a good job last week. Why don't you do it again this week? And I think that that's a good point for anybody listening to this podcast to recognize some of these non-intentional biases that are starting to come out, maybe not starting to come out, but just are existent within the workforce.
Yeah, I have some research to support what you were just talking about. But the one thing I always say to everyone in the room, men and women, is there's no finger pointing here. We're here to kind of grow and learn. And so making it a judgment-free zone where we can ask questions and, fumble through this is how we're going to be able to stand up and speak out. And so what you were talking about women kind of always raising their hand, taking on the extra assignment, is actually rooted in performance bias. So that's the everyday bias where we tend to underestimate women's performance and overestimate men's performance. So, for example, women oftentimes are hired or promoted based on their past accomplishments. They need to prove that they have the experience and the skills, while men are often hired and promoted based on potential. We assume they have the skills they need and we're looking at their future viable options. So then how that shows up is how that bias works is it tends to put this pressure on women that they have to extra perform. They have to take on extra opportunities because they're underestimated. And it's just funny. It's one of those things that's why I talk about, what can women be conscious of that they're kind of falling into because these stereotypes are pushed on them, and what can men be aware of, making sure that it's a level playing field.
And this creates somewhat of a catch-22 for women in the workplace as you talk about this, because we have to work our way up within the company and we have to prove that we're valuable versus potential for men. But also if you push back too far, push back too hard, then you're seen as a non-team player or a non-conformist. Yeah. And so this is kind of a two-edged sword or catch-22. So I guess 2 questions. What can men do to kind of help this along? And then what can women do to not get caught in that catch-22 trap?
Okay, that's a great question. So, and funny, you were talking about likability bias. So that's the fact that, we expect men to be assertive, and when they lead, it feels natural. We expect women to be kind and communal. So when they do assert themselves, we like them less. When they are, we call them overly ambitious, all these things. So first step for everybody does begin with awareness, right? Just understanding these everyday types of bias, like the ones I shared: performance bias, likability bias. Maternal bias is the most common, which is that motherhood triggers all these false assumptions that women are less committed and then even less competent. So first step is just kind of understanding it, both women and men, because then you can start to get to the second step is you have to look for it and you have to have some tools to do something about it. And one of the easiest things to think of as an individual is think about those key inflection points in the workplace and in somebody's career journey. One is getting them in the door, recruiting. 2 is having them thrive and feel engaged day to day. And 3rd is having them be promoted and advance their potential. So I think men can constantly look to be one of those ambassadors that whatever industry they're in, or if they're starting their own company, that they are actively looking for a gender balanced workforce, right? And shining a light on the diverse individuals in their group, that's seeing is believing, showing people that work in the company that will look like the people that you want to attract. And then the everyday stuff is just like the things that I talked about, just kind of thinking about meeting dynamics. Do you feel like women are sitting in the back of the room? Are they at the seat of the table? Are they speaking as much? Men interrupt women 3 times more often than other men. Just like things like that. I think, again, it's not finger pointing, but I watch the men that are in my workshops, the light bulb goes on and says, wow, I didn't realize that was happening. I joke that my 5-year-old knows that statistic about how men interrupt women 3 times more often, and she uses it against her father. I'm like, well, it doesn't really count for parenting. But the third part is advancement. And so here's what men can do there. Mentor more women. And men, the questions that they've been asking me aligns with the research that since Me Too and Time's Up and the awakening of this conversation in the workplace, the unfortunate negative impact is that men are 3 times more uncomfortable mentoring women.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Just as you said that, I go, on the surface, I see what you're saying and I agree with it, but how do we do it without causing problems? Perceived problems, let me add.
Perceived problems. Right. Everybody's just, they're also, you're worried about, your own job. So anyway, I have a great resource on my website, joankuhl.com, that gives guidance on building a safe, trusting mentor relationship, specifically with men and women. And I talk about the concept of reverse mentoring, which is when a junior employee is mentoring the senior experienced employee. And so again, that would be like an older, more experienced male with a younger female, but just having some guidelines about making sure that you mentor men and women in the same environments, in the same way, it gives everybody so much more comfort. And same for women too, to kind of have that reference sheet of boundaries so that they can approach conversations. I think that that's what everybody needs. So just like, give me some guidelines, give me some tools, tell me how I can do this. I want to be a champion here. I want to make progress. There's things that will make you nervous.
Yeah. And one of the thoughts I was having as we talk through this is, are we seeing improvement? Are you seeing the workforce getting better, or are you seeing that we're maintaining status quo, or are we actually sliding backwards a little bit?
In some fields, we're sliding backwards, but in others, we're making progress. So, some of the good news I've heard in the last couple of months is that on Fortune 500 boards, there's been more women than before, nominated in those director positions. And that's the senior most leadership position you can have in some of our most influential companies. So that's good news. We still have way too many boards that have only one woman. Far too many have more than that. And that's a tough phenomenon itself when you're the only in the room. STEM is one of those fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, that we are continuing to, as much effort that we're putting into educating women earlier, we got to get in there earlier, like kindergarten, talking about coding and making it exciting and fun and using the right language before they get those predisposed stereotypes. And then we also, in the workplace itself, in those companies, like you're talking about, the technology companies, we have to make it clear that it's a great place to be and that the women are there. So I think the good news is that, as I said before, we've got more women entering fields or majoring in fields that were dominated by men. Where we've got to do the work is just right now, every day inside companies, and then at the level of leadership, where if you're somebody in a senior leader position that can make the call around talent pipeline and promotions and leadership development, making sure that there's gender balance, there's an equal number of women and men there.
Well, those are some great ideas and something that we really need to, as leaders. I mean, this is the Modern Leadership Podcast, and the leaders that are listening right now, we need to take it upon ourselves to kind of move the needle. We need to be the leaders, lead out in this. And one of the things that we can do is really be conscious of what's going on around us. Whether we're male or female, as leaders within our companies, we need to look at mentoring. We need to look at kind of the way that we make assignments throughout our work and really give everybody the right opportunity for them. So A couple of last questions before we move on to the final section of the podcast. One is this: what is this myth of meritocracy? We've talked about it a little bit, but I want to identify it directly for our listeners.
Sure. So the myth of meritocracy is really just speaking to the idea that you do good work and equal opportunity and recognition comes your way. And that's just not the case.
Well, it's historically been the case, but it's changing, right? I mean, the idea of meritocracy came from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? But now we're in 2019.
But even then, the part that everybody's missing about, just doing your work and you get rewarded. Sure, if like you're on the manufacturing line and there's X number of widgets to make and you hit your goal or you didn't. But the kicker is relationships. Relationships are always going to be influential. Your ability to influence others through your presence and your communication skills. And so that recognition that you've got to have the talent, you got to do the work. There's never like going to be a compromise on actually producing results. But you also have to have those relationships and understand like how influence is distributed and be aware of that. And so women typically in studies, they just want this environment where it's just hard work is rewarded above all else. And that's not our culture. We have to be able to speak up to our capabilities. Not everybody, like your boss's boss, may be making decisions about your next assignment, and he doesn't know what your capabilities or results are from you. He knows it from your boss. So if you aren't really building that rapport and relationship with your boss and continuing to give him or her the ammunition and the language to talk about what your strengths are, it doesn't make it through to those conversations. It's just really just being eyes wide open about this. And it can frustrate women a lot in the corporate hierarchy, but it's just one of those things that's why, it's dig your heels and navigate corporate BS and build the company you deserve. Like if we're building genuine relationships and we have equal opportunity to show up and offer our talents, then we also have to learn how to be able to brag and boast about them so that, our brand is known.
And one of the thoughts that I've been having is as a society, as a work culture society, I think that we're moving more from generalist to specialist. Whereas 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, a doctor would go through school and come out and be a general practitioner. You could go see them for any ailment. Or a lawyer would come out and they would practice door law, and anything that came through the door they would be able to handle. But as a society, we're moving more towards specialists, where now I practice a certain kind of law, and not just a certain industry of law, but a very niche industry within the industry of law, or in medicine, or whatever it may be in STEM. How does the move from generalism to specialist, affect this idea of meritocracy?
That's interesting. My first reaction, like in thinking about that, is that is a product of being completely overwhelmed by the amount of information available to us now. And that, the information on the internet is overwhelming, and there's so much noise coming at you from a media perspective, from your phone to your device, ringing in your pocket, all this stuff all day long, that I actually feel like that's the root that is inspiring people to want to go deep in one specific area so that they can really feel clear about the impact that they're having, or really clearly position themselves as what they can do, how they can help. And so I think that, and I guess from the standpoint of how it relates to achieving equality in the workforce, is just to make sure that women still continue to enter those fields that traditionally were dominated by men, and that we still don't become biased, that if we see a bunch of physicians in the room or people in a hospital, that we assume the men are the doctors and the women are nurses. That's probably the only thing that I can think of there. But I don't know. I think the workplace is changing in so many ways, and we're just constantly adapting to what we're helping people navigate through. And in this case, I think it is information overload.
Yeah, and we're going to see some massive changes over the next number of years. And, we have a lot of work to do. We have a long way to go in a lot of different areas, not just in gender bias, but in all sorts of different diversity biases that we have within the workforce. And I know you do a lot of speaking on the generations. I know you do a lot of research and speaking on what's going on in the workforce, not just from a gender point, but in all different ways. And I think this is all going to play out moving forward as we look at the large generation of baby boomers that are leaving the workforce, which is creating this vacuum of opportunity for younger people of any gender to kind of move into these roles. And that's why I think over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to see a massive shift in leadership. We're going to see a massive shift in just employment and culture and a lot of different things. It's going to be exciting to see. And I imagine you've got a number of books still left in you to write about these different emerging topics.
Yeah, I am so energized by millennials, Gen Z, by the next generation. I was just at Nike headquarters a couple weeks ago, leading a workshop for U.S. Soccer and their She Believes Summit. So it was college age women and hundreds, and the energy and the excitement and the collaboration with each other was amazing. And then, you kind of follow them on social media afterwards and how they, shared their success with their male peers. So I see so much collaboration between our younger generations across boundaries of race, ethnicity, gender. They don't see it. I mean, we've got a generation that almost half identify as non-white in United States, millennials. So I just think that they bring so much more than what reality TV displays about them. They really are working on ideas and issues that are going to make this a better world to live in. So I am a true believer that this next generation, if given more earlier opportunities to lead, are going to transform the workplace.
Well, very cool. And if we had a longer podcast or a couple additional episodes, we really need to jump into that topic. But alas, our time running a bit short. Let's switch topics and head over to Learning from Leaders, where we dive into a little bit of personal to go along with this business conversation. Sound like a plan?
Sure.
All right. Our first topic is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading these days?
So I'm always reading 5 books at the same time.
5 books at the same time. Oh.
Yeah, it's like how my brain works. So I've got right now The Myth of the Nice Girl, written by Fran Hauser, is awesome. I've got The Fifth Trimester by Lauren Smith Brody, which is amazing from a data point and understanding. And for men and women in any type of company, it gives you all that you need to help your workforce policies be family friendly. And then finally, Brave Not Perfect was written by the founder of Girls Who Code, Reshma Saujani. And those 3 books inspire me so much, but I like zigzag. So I always pick like 3 books at a time that I can bop back and forth between.
And how do you choose which one you're going to read tonight? Do you just kind of pop it on and whatever sounds good?
I think I'm similar to most women, is that I really do rely on the table of content, and it's what's coming up for me that day. And that's why I choose the books that I'm reading, is what topic do I need to learn more of? Am I facing, or, I just, need some more depth and understanding. And I mean, I need to read more fun books. I like sprinkle those in. Actually, I feel like I get the fun books because I have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I'm reading plenty of Dr. Seuss every night.
Great stuff there. I've been through that stage, and I still read with my kids. I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old. We still read almost every night, but now our books have changed to the Harry Potters and the Percy Jacksons and things like that. But
I love it.
There's so much to learn from stories of fiction. So
definitely.
That's great. Our next question is your leadership superpower.
Yeah. So you know what mine is? You know how Wonder Woman has the lasso that makes everybody tell the truth? I would want one that actually brings out people's vulnerability, because I think if you're saying my leadership superpower in the workplace, there's some type of fear that makes people act differently than they truly are, or they're not really telling you what's going on or what's really haunting them or what's making them so fearful. So I feel like giving them that permission to be vulnerable will actually make relationships stronger. That's my superpower that I want.
And a terrific superpower. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, when we talk leadership these days, we're talking way more about authenticity and vulnerability. And it's a shifting landscape that a leader can be open, not only can be, but should be, because it's impacting the workforce. So what a great superpower. Next thought is your motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by.
Yeah, I have so many, and they're all by the same woman who's been my mentor for 20 years. So Frances Hesselbein, she's the former CEO of the Girl Scouts of the USA, and my daughter and I just had lunch with her yesterday. Psst, don't tell, but she's 103 years old and goes to work every day.
Yeah.
But her two quotes that I loved are, "To serve is to live," and "Leadership is how to be, not how to do."
Our final question then is the book most often gifted to friends, family, or colleagues?
Oh my goodness. Actually, Enough as You Are, written by Rachel Simmons. She's an expert on girls, but I mean, Enough as She Is, it's called, because I think that everybody experiences imposter syndrome, not feeling like they're good enough, and men and women. It holds back women more. So I gift it a lot just for people to think about, what's that evil inner DJ telling you in your head that you need to shut down so you can go after what you really want.
Yeah, and it's so important, right? I mean, leadership and success really starts with mindset. It starts between your ears, and it's so important that you believe in yourself and the opportunities that are out there. And sometimes they're not apparent. Sometimes you can't see them directly, but you have to believe that they're out there, and you have to step towards that dream that you have, work hard, and sometimes you have to overcome obstacles. I mean, we just spent the last 30 minutes on this episode talking about some of the obstacles that some of our great leaders are going to face as they grow and work through the workforce. And they have to believe, and they have to work hard. And sometimes they're going to get knocked down, but they need to stand back up and realize that they are good enough. They are worthy of these leadership opportunities, and they need to take them. Joan, this has been such a fascinating conversation. Before we let you go today, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. Before you go, please, how can we get a copy of your book and find out more about you and connect?
Thank you so much, Jake, for having me. So the website for the book is digyourheelsin.com. You can get all the information. It's available at all places books are sold. But if you purchase the book through the website, there's a bunch of free things I'll send your way. A masterclass on life and work hacks and a Jumpstart Your Career guide. And then to learn more about what I'm up to at joankuhl.com, JOANKUHL.com. There's a lot of information and stories, free resources if you're a manager, a leader, a young professional, or a student to really help you drive towards the career that you want and make a difference for having an inclusive workplace around you.
And is there a social media channel you hang out on?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Joan Kuhl, JOANKUHL, and LinkedIn, and I have a Facebook page as well, all under my name.
Very nice. Well, we'll link all those up on the show notes and make sure that those listeners, the leaders listening to this podcast, can go over and get some of this valuable insight and resources and research that you've done. Joan, this has been a terrific conversation. We need to have more conversations like this. If we're going to change the work environment, we need to talk about it. So thank you for coming on this episode and being our guest expert.
Thank you, Jake. Thanks for shining a light on it. Pleasure to be here.
All right, my friends, what did you think of that? A big thank you to Joan for coming on the podcast today and talking about a topic that is, front and center right now when it comes to leadership and the workforce, and that is different types of biases, including gender bias within the workplace, and what we as leaders need to do to make sure that we are not falling trap to some of these long-held traditional biases, that we really look for opportunities. Being the father of a couple of daughters, one of the conversations I often have with them is, you can do anything. There is no opportunity that is not available for you out there, including president of the free world. If you want to be president, you go after it because you are smart enough, talented enough, you have the opportunity to do it. And I think this is the message that we need to communicate to those around us. Joan talks a lot about mentoring. Mentoring is so vitally important when it comes to raising the next group of leaders. Of course, everything that we talked about on this episode of the podcast can be found on the show notes, jakeacarlson.com/ML132. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life, and never forget, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.